Welcome to the Business Trendsetter Podcast, where we talk about trends and how to use them to grow your business. My name is Manny Turan.
And I'm Adam Bartok.
We're Spark Partners. We're here every week to give you some deep insights on the world of business. And a lot of our listeners are small and medium-sized business owners and executives. And one of the things that is interesting to note is that we talk about things happening all over the world. We talk about events happening in Europe or Asia, and we get some feedback that, hey, that's not really pertinent to me. I run a garage. I fix cars in Benson, Arizona, which is an hour away from Tucson. Or, hey, I've got a small family farm in Wisconsin. So, these things are all tied together. And I think that's a really good topic for us today, Adam, how some of these geopolitical things happening across these oceans have implications because of trends, because of the way that things are laid out to all of our business owners here in the U.S.
Yeah. There's a tendency for people to say, I want to worry about the things I can control. And they put a lot of attention into that. And the issue is that the things you can't control is infinitely larger than the things you can control. So the most important thing we do in business is really to scan what's happening and what we can't control so that we can move, just adapt the things we can control to the external world. We invert that too often. We sit down and say, well, I want to manage what I can manage. I'm going to try to hang on to this way of management as long as I can, and tend to see changes in the world as being threatening, putting us on the defensive, when it should be just the opposite. We should be saying, what's going on in the world and how do I get there? And most of our podcasts, we focus on things that are pretty near term, like what's happening in the marketplace in the United States, because the vast majority of our listeners are in the United States. But geopolitics is a big thing, and it really does affect all businesses. And if you think ahead, you could be positioned to be a much more successful company. You'd be one of the first ones in the game. So let's take, for example, 30 years ago, well, not that far ago. Let's go back 20 years. 20 years ago, if you were a furniture manufacturer, you were cutting down trees in southeastern U.S., and you were making furniture somewhere in the Carolinas probably. And what happened was early on, people started to realize that even with automation, they could cut down the tree, ship the raw lumber over to China, and then they could set up a manufacturing facility in China that would be somewhat automated, but not as much as the U.S., and make the furniture and ship it back. And even with the shipping back and forth of this raw material, heavy material, wood, it was cheaper to do the manufacturing. And so we saw that many big name manufacturers that didn't quickly seize this went out of business. On the other hand, small manufacturers who did see what was happening seized upon it, and in fact, it flourished with a lot of small custom manufacturers. So you could go into the furniture shop, and instead of going in and they said, these are the chairs we have, or sofas we have, etc. They'd walk in and say, these are all the styles we have, and here's a magazine or a booklet that has other styles in fact, and here's a whole lot of samples of material that we use. And then what we'll do is we'll custom make the furniture you want. And you'll have a custom sofa that fits your house with the fabric you like. Then it'll probably take us 8 weeks to 12 weeks to get it for you, but it won't be off the shelf. And by the way, we could do that for the same price or even less than an off-the-shelf piece of furniture. And so we saw the market then started to split, much more custom furniture, much more high-end furniture, and the people that made lots of furniture tended to fall into a very much lower category, which ended up competing with IKEA. Right? And the IKEA process got furniture that was so darn cheap it was throwaway. You didn't bother to move and take the furniture when you moved. You either left it or threw it out on the curb.
Yeah.
So that's an example of this global geopolitical events that affected people that were mostly not even publicly traded companies, privately held companies making furniture. And the thing is that I would agree that people today don't have time to do their own scenario planning about geopolitical events because it is difficult and it's complicated. You and I spend a lot of time doing interpreting on it, but that's what we do for a living. But it would be hard for me to say to somebody that's got a small business in Tucson, yeah, why don't you take, X number of hours every month to study geopolitical events? They don't even have the framework for it. Do they have the data for it? But the good news is the people who do this love to give away their information. Like, I'm an alumni of the Boston Consulting Group. I worked there in the 1980s. When I joined the Boston Consulting Group, I think they had 7 offices, maybe 500 employees. Now it's got, I think, something like 75 offices, and I think they've got a few thousand employees around the world. And they even have an office of geopolitical analysis. So what we know is when I say pay attention to geopolitical events, you can join up, you can hook up to get the BCG emails and get their newsletters. You can pick, and you can pick the ones from the Geopolitical group. Or, the New York Times does geopolitical analysis, the Washington Post, a lot of universities. So you could go to Google, look up who's doing geopolitical analysis, and then you could subscribe. Morton does it. You can pick subscribe, and then you could just scan these once a month to try to take a look at them. And that's a way that you could keep up to date and start to see the balls moving really in advance. And so today, let me give you a good example. The Boston Consulting Group put out a newsletter today about the future of geopolitical events, and it talked about scenario planning. And of course, Manny, you and I, we love scenario planning,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
That's a good thing to do. And so here, now, we take a look at it like, okay, this is free. You don't have to pay Manny or I to do this, right? This is free. It's stuff you can get. So let me tell you what they said. They saw 4 scenarios coming about in the world over the next half dozen years. Okay, so this is pretty current. It's going to happen fairly quickly. Scenario 1, they call Back to the Future. That's just as we return to the old world order and global cooperation and minimum military conflicts. Now, what's important to me is that's 1 of 4, whereas the vast majority of small businesses I talk to are operating as if that's what's going to happen. They're like, well, that's the way it's always been. This is how we've done business. This is the geopolitical order. Yes, we've got a war in the Ukraine, but how does that really affect me? Right? Yes, the Putin had a meeting with Xi Jinping in China. The Russians and the Chinese are getting closer, and the Russians and the North Koreans are getting closer. But what does that have to do with me? Well, the reality is that the world order that before we were comfortable and we were able to go forward, presuming there wouldn't be more military conflicts, that there wouldn't be another Ukraine happening in another part of the world. We didn't really live that concerned about China invading Taiwan. But that's not the global world order we're in now. Because
Very
we do
different.
have these problems happen in the world, right? So that's just one scenario. And I think you got to be thinking about what happens if the other scenarios happen. So the second one they call the proliferation of regional conflicts. And that's where we start seeing these different parts of the world that aren't the USA, China, Russia, and probably some named European countries, however you'd like to put the European group together over there. It says these smaller countries continue to break into conflicts. Major powers feed money, feed ammunition, but don't get involved, which is effectively what's happening now in Gaza. It's effectively what's happening in the Ukraine. And they said this could keep speaking of Yemen. We're going to have these countries where these wars are breaking out, but it's going to be more persistent. It'll happen again and again and again. And if that happens, now all of a sudden we got to build up the U.S. military complex, right? That creates opportunity if you're willing to be in the defense industry. It would become another growth environment like it was in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. So you would start seeing we would participate in that, whereas there probably wouldn't be as much money available for other programs. And so if you're in some other programs like education or social programs, you might see it say, well, those are liable to get cut. They're liable to not be able to maintain because there's so much more money flowing into defense for people to spend money. The third scenario, they call multipolar rivalry. And this is where these regional blocks like the United States, maybe U.S. and NATO, and then there's this BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, which is now also associated with South Africa, and a handful of other notable countries, that BRIC region. So these regional groups start to rebalance the global dynamic so that the major powers are now having to spend a lot more time trying to avoid direct conflict, trying to figure out if you can have trade, because this would now restrict trade. It would dramatically reduce the amount of trade between the U.S. and China. So if you're dependent now on your furniture being made in China, it's not likely to happen. And if China's influence in Vietnam and Thailand and the Philippines grows, because they're out running boats out in South China Sea, shooting up Philippine boats all the time right now, then what happens is we're starting to say, wow, you better be aware, because if you're getting machine parts, if you're getting furniture, if you're getting your raw materials, if you're dog food manufacturers actually put together dog food in those parts of the world, right? Then you're going to have, that could become very, very difficult. So we could see a great reduction in international trade. Then the fourth scenario is what they call global escalation. And this is a crippling scenario of economic and military confrontations, powerless global institutions, nobody can come out on top, rising cyber attacks, and AI weaponization, which is the sort of doomsday scenario that the AI people warn about and we hear people talk about. Now, it's easy to take the last three, the way you said, those are going to be significant changes in the world, and say, I'm not going to do anything until something happens. But all of them both present an opportunity to recognize where your strategy could be weak and where there could be new opportunities.
Yeah, I think what we see a lot of businesses do is they play the ostrich game.
Yeah.
They put their head in the sand. They know things are happening, but they have this mentality of, well, I can't control that. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to sit here and do my own thing. But the problem is the my own thing can change very quickly, as you said, if something happens in the geopolitical realm. And everything's interconnected. I mean, the supply chain is was proven to be not as strong if you go back 3 4 years during the pandemic when we had these major issues with the shelves being empty
Right.
and ships getting locked up and not being able to dock. So I think a smart business person at any level, from a solopreneur all the way to a multinational billion-dollar company, needs to be looking at these scenarios. Obviously, BCG is a well-established, very well-known, well-respected organization. For somebody to snub their finger at them saying, they don't know what they're talking about, is a fool's game.
Yeah. Now, let me point out another problem. At the end of this report, BCG says which scenario they think is most likely. I hate that they did that. And the reason I hate that is because when we're working with clients, they're always asking us, well, Adam, Manny, what's the most likely scenario? And the point of scenario planning isn't to say which is the most likely, because in fact, then you'll spend your time on that one over the other options that you have. And the point of scenario planning is to say these could happen, and how would we prepare for them? There was a concept about a decade ago that people talked a lot about what they called black swans. And it was this idea of an occasional event that's not predictable, but that is dramatic, right? So an occasional, some dramatic event would happen. And what I don't really like the term black swan. I appreciate that it's out of favor because of connotations related to it. But the concept, which is there could be something that looks like a 10% probability, but when that happens, it's a big deal.
Right.
Those are the things that create the biggest threats and the biggest opportunities. And so if you don't think about that for a while, so again, I always come back to my motion around, electric cars. And I still get a lot of grief from a lot of people about my projections for electric car consumption, how fast I think it's going to grow. But what I do is I look at how much of our economy is dependent upon internal combustion engines, right? You look at these little engines are on everything from lawnmowers to weed whackers to, powering your house with a home generator to the car you drive. And then you have all these people that do maintenance on that. We have all the supplies related to that, gasoline, fuel filters, mufflers, all kinds of things that go with that. And then if it's vehicles, then obviously there's brakes and transmissions. And there's lots of componentry that there wouldn't be in an EV. So I sit there and I'll say to somebody, look, let's say you disagree with me about the rate at which EVs will come aboard. But what if I'm right? And if I am right, or if it even happens faster than I said, what's going to be the implication for your business? What's going to happen, right?
Right.
So, for example, it's something we'll probably talk about in the future. Rivian, with the sales not being as robust this year in EVs as they had been, Rivian looked pretty weak. They sold a lot of cars, SUVs and pickups, but they were cash flow negative. The stock really dropped. Didn't look like anybody was going to. They didn't have any good path forward to raise money. It looked like they could hit bankruptcy, which would be really bad. It would certainly hurt the investors, but also hurt all the people who have a Rivian car. In Normal, Illinois, where they're made, it would hurt the factory. Well, today they put together a $5 billion deal with Volkswagen. And so now it looks like pretty surely they're not going to be out of business. They're going to stay in the game. They're going to keep going. So there was a situation where you could say, okay, there would look like there was like a 10% chance Rivian would be around in the next 5 years. All of a sudden that 10% becomes 100%. And now you got to look at it and say, okay, that's going to be good for the growth in the EV market. So the four scenarios that the BCG put forward here, and like I said, you could hit their website and you can download this report. We have to treat all of them equal. And that's the hard part I think that a lot of small business people have. They want to quickly say, wait a minute, I need to get this I want to narrow it down to one. Well, that's kind of the wrong reason to do scenario planning.
I think a lot of people want to do that because they believe that going at all four or having a scenario plan for all four will be 4 times the amount of resources.
Yeah.
And a lot of these things are just a matter. I mean, I know one company that is, they have 95% of their, I won't go into details, but they make 95% of their product in China today. And they started looking at alternate locations for this product that they manufacture in China at a contract manufacturer. They went out and looked, and there's Vietnam, South Korea, Mexico, other places, and they're more expensive in those places. But guess what? If something happens in scenarios 2 through 4 that you mentioned, the BCG there could be a situation where we can't get anything from China. That they
Great.
literally put blocks. Now we can go into details that saying that China needs us as much as we need them, and there's all that. There's no doubt. But if there's a war between the two countries, I guarantee trade's going to stop.
Well, okay, let's get back. We always talk about get the facts and look at the facts and then interpret the facts. So here's a fact. In 2000, last year, the U.S. Had a inversion in terms of trade with China. And we've historically run an historical, we imported a lot more than we exported. The balance of trade was highly in China's favor. Well, last year, we swung that 14 points. 14 points. We reduced the imports dramatically and increased our exports to China. Now, that was a complete 180 from what had happened for like the 10 years prior to that. So that's a factoid. You can kind of say, well, it's a big factoid, Adam. What does that have to do with me? It tells you right off the get-go that policies and supply chain issues have already changed. We've already had a big change in that we're doing more manufacturing in the United States. We're keeping more of our products here. We're importing less from China. So we've already started down that road. Now, that means that it's going to just continue probably to get more difficult as time goes along. And policies like where you have to say how much of your product was imported from China, tariffs, get slapped on top of things. It makes them cost more. And it also just makes it for a more difficult trade environment. Can you get on a plane and fly to China and have the kind of reception, negotiation, and then be as reliant on them doing what you hoped they would do? 20 years ago, we accepted with a lot of faith that when Chinese companies said, we're going to make something for you, they would.
Yeah.
We treated them with Western countries, like Western suppliers. But nowadays, the government's taking a much more involved, has a much bigger hand in what's going on in business. And we can see that again with world events in Hong Kong, where, for years, Hong Kong was an independent entity. It wasn't but a half dozen years ago that China said, well, we're going to shift that a little bit. We're going to start exerting more control on Hong Kong, which was their territory because the British left. And now, just 6 years later, Hong Kong's Chinese. It's not Hong Kong independent anymore. It really is very much Chinese. And, I literally know dozens of people, dozens, maybe hundreds of people that I've known over time that lived and worked in Hong Kong that were emissaries for their business, doing trade, living in Hong Kong in order to work with factories that are based in China, putting together different elements of supply chain that have left. They no longer live in Hong Kong. They no longer do business in China. They've all had to find new jobs. So it's important that our base out there realize this is a movement that's already started. Just like the EV movement has started, doing less imports from China has already started.
If you do international trade, it behooves you to look at the demographic data of the country that you do business with. For instance, in China, since we're talking about China, the average age is starting to go of the workers are in their 40s, mid to late 40s.
Yeah.
And so that means that there's this whole base of younger people in China that aren't in existence. They don't exist because of the one-child policy and lots of other reasons. So now the manufacturing base is going to grow older and eventually going to age out. The whole real estate potential collapse in China. They have 3 billion places to live for 1.4 billion people. So there's a lot of issues there that might actually trickle down to your business if you're heavily reliant on something that's done in Germany. Of course, they have demographic issues as well. So there's a lot of reasons to look at the geopolitics. And if you're in a situation where you don't really understand where to start, that's a great place to give me or Adam, send us an email for sure.
And again, I think a lot of people forget just how much supply we get from Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. I mean, we get a lot from them. And when we've reduced our dependence on China, we've moved more trade to those countries. But now again, pay attention to world events. Putin just recently, I think last week, went to Vietnam and met with the premier of Vietnam. And, you can sit there and say, so what? Well, it's a big deal because what's happening is, Putin is having all these meetings with Kim Jong-un and North Korea. He's having meetings with Xi Jinping in China. Now he's having meetings in Vietnam. He's trying to put together an alliance, right? They're trying to get the Chinese, the BRIC thing, they're trying to get a lot of power to that. If they can do that, then you could instantly lose your ability to have manufacturing or imports from Vietnam. In the Philippines, it's been a year now that we've had these Chinese naval vessels shooting at Philippine boats in the South China Sea. So fishing boats are being shot at, sometimes destroyed by the Chinese Navy. Again, you can sit back and say, what can I do about it? We can't do anything about it unless what happens is this is a precursor towards China more aggressively shutting down trade with the Philippines, making it difficult for us to do trade in the Philippines, or perhaps they, all out trying to take over the Philippines. So these geopolitical events are news, but they're often something that we don't as small business people think about. On the
Right.
other hand, we should, because you might have been saying, you know what, I saw somebody outsource, for example, their call center to the Philippines. This is pretty common. They've got a very large, robust infrastructure in the Philippines to service people. Often, call centers tend to believe that Filipinos don't have quite as difficult an accent for Americans to understand as, say, India. And so you can say, hey, I got to have a call center. I'm going to put it in the Philippines. Well, are you ready if that call center goes down and is down permanently? Do you have a
Yep.
backup plan? You know what you're going to do? You better start thinking about that stuff right now.
So there's another angle that I think needs to be discussed is not only your suppliers, but where are your customers? Same thing. If your customers are all in the Philippines or your customers are all overseas, who are they? What world events can have a detrimental effect on them or even your customers' customers? I think it's important just to
Yeah.
look at the entire landscape. And I think scenario planning really comes down to, remember those books, those choose your own adventure books, where if you go in one direction, you go to page 12, you go somewhere else, you go to page 50. It's a lot of that. You've got to literally lay out these things on a piece of paper and just think about it. A lot of people don't talk about these things, let alone write them down. I mean, how many companies do you and I see, Adam, that actually have scenario plans written down for what they do? Almost none.
Almost none. Almost none. I mean, they might talk about it a little bit, and if I can push it hard enough, we get some things on the whiteboard. But getting that to really develop out into a scenario with implications is difficult. People start saying, "Well, pigs could fly," and all these statements like that, saying that there isn't any veracity towards scenario planning. Well, that's just not true. Good scenario planning, you use facts, you use trends, and you can sit there and look forward and see what's going to happen. So let's take another one. The U.S. is the world currency, which is great. And it's very good for us because everybody in the world does business in dollars, right? And that helps us a lot because that means there's demand for dollars. People in foreign countries, foreign governments are buying dollars in order to do business with us. So it helps prop up the dollar. It helps support us in international trade. If I go to sell something in a foreign country, it's easy to do because of the dollars. Well, when the euro first came along, there was a lot of concern that by putting all the countries together, you dismiss all these different countries from France, Germany, England, etc., and you would get one common currency, and it would be bigger and more powerful than the dollar. It would displace the dollar, and that was very concerning because it would shift the power balance to Europe, right? Well, as it happened, the alliance never really got that strong. They never cooperated good enough to where they could get that much strength economically, and they never developed the manufacturing base, the production base, the innovation base effectively across Europe, so that even though they had a common currency, it didn't become the powerhouse that had been dreamt of when they were putting this together in the 1980s. Well, then we shifted towards thinking about China. The Chinese government, the economy was growing so much faster than the United States that it looked very much like the Chinese renminbi or the yuan would be able to become the base. And in fact, the Chinese economy is bigger than the United States, at least as big. I mean, right on that precipice of which is going to be bigger. But the notion I'm going to get at here is that it was, by all logical standards, the currency should shift to be the Chinese if they're the largest economy in the world. That would be the most sensible currency to have. Well, right, as people were sort of seeing this happen and seeing it come forward and saying, what's going to be the implication on the dollar? 2 years ago, this was a really big deal. Well, right now, what's happened is people don't trust the Chinese. And so because they're concerned about, particularly concerned about this war over the South China Sea with the Filipinos, and now thinking about, are they going to try something in Taiwan? They're saying, well, we don't really trust the Chinese enough to make it a reserve currency. So it still becomes the dollar. But see, the point is you could be like, I didn't even think about this, and it was the dollar, and I'm fine. Yeah, you'll be fine sometimes. That's the truth. But wouldn't it be better to have thought it through? Wouldn't it be better to have said, well, I was prepared if things changed? That's the point that I think we want to get at with scenario planning is that you're prepared for these options.
Yeah, I think there's workshops that we run. I know Adam, you've done lots of them, and even more conversational type consulting and coaching, where we look at your business, we help to understand the web of suppliers and who their our suppliers are, and your customers and your competitors. If we understand the whole landscape, then we can give you some thoughts based on our knowledge of these world events on what things might disrupt your business. I think scenario planning has to do with being adaptable and being able to shift. And if you're not adaptable, if you're like that ostrich with the head in the sand, you're going to really miss not only an opportunity, but you can actually decimate your business if you're not planning for what may happen. And those four you listed are
Right.
interesting. I care to guess that the BCG group said that the number two is the one. I haven't read the article, but I'm
They
curious.
actually they actually said at this point they're not preference. Their thinking is that it would be the multipolar rivalry where there would be several regional blocks of countries and it would rebalance global dynamics.
So number
Uh,
three, huh?
yeah, we would avoid direct conflict, but there would just be just a crush of international trade. It would be much more difficult to do international trade. Um, yeah, I mean, it trying to think through kind of what these implications are for us is often difficult. But the reason is, well, I'll just give you another example. I was recently talking to an attorney, okay, and attorneys have a definite business, right? And I don't walk in and try to help coach an attorney by saying, well, why don't you become a medical doctor, right? You got to start with something around, you got to agree that you want to be an attorney. And what happened in the conversation was talking about how successful somebody like Gloria Allred was. Now, do you know who Gloria Allred is?
No.
She's a woman my age or a little bit older than my age who she was an early defender of women's rights. And she's positioned in such a place that when a woman is attacked, bad things are said, when a woman's rights are violated in many different ways, Gloria Allred will often jump to the defense and she'll often be on television. And they'll say, well, Gloria, has this woman's rights been attacked? What things could she do now? That kind of thing, right? So she's very well known. Therefore, she attracts a lot of clients, and it's good for her business. And when I tried to make sure this lawyer understood, he said, I'd like to, kind of have that. And I said, yeah, here's what you have to be wary of. You could say, I like the law, and you say, I like a part of the law. But if you don't pick a part of the law that's going to grow, your expertise isn't going to help you to grow. So she picked that she would be a defender of women's rights. And as has happened over the last 40 years, there's been a growing interest in women's rights. There's been a growing interest in women in the workplace. There's been a growing interest in how we behave when women are around and whether or not we're violating their rights, right? So there was a growth area in terms of what was happening behaviorally in the economy, which led to an opportunity for more litigation, and there were more lawsuits. So she was positioned in a growing area. So what I'm getting at with this is if you want to have a big law firm, you want to position yourself in a growing area. So you watch television, you'll see advertisers come on, hey, I'm the guy to call if you have a motorcycle accident. I'm the guy to call if you have a trucking accident. And when I look at those, I say to myself, there's a lot of people in those sectors, and not a lot of them are growing. Consumption of motorcycles is not going up. It is not a growth market. Right? The average motorcycle rider is like something like 50 years old now. So you kind of have this bifurcated market where you got old guys that are riding Harleys and then you got young people in crotch rockets. But what tends to happen is that the middle part of the marketplace, which is people, sort of 30 to 50, 55, they don't ride motorcycles. So it didn't become the hobby that it was 35 years ago with people. So that guy's advertising for motorcycle accidents, but he's not advertising in a growth market, right? And because it's not in a growth market, his chances of becoming really successful aren't nearly as good. And so you got to find the growth market. You got to find the growth opportunity. So if I think the case of Gloria Allred, I don't know if she intended it, but she certainly ended up in the right place at the right time because the global market thinking about women's rights was just set to take off 40 years ago. And she became an advocate for that position. So that's what I think we're trying to do with scenario planning is say what's going to happen. I think, again, one of the big takeaways that would be from these 4 scenarios they put together is 3 of them had tremendous discussion about defense. And we're seeing a lot of money spent on defense. And if you go do just a little bit of research, some people have asked me, just offhandedly, do I know why, for example, the United States was slow to supply certain defense products to Ukraine? And the obvious answer is, well, we don't want to get into a war with Russia. That was part of it. Another part of it was we don't have that many munitions. Like our defense industry got, relatively speaking, quite a bit smaller since Vietnam. We haven't been thinking about going to war with China or somebody like that. So we've let our military get smaller. Yeah. So if we start sending all of our military goods to Israel so that they can use them in their war, or if we send them to the Ukraine to use in their war, what happens is we become less capable of our own defense. And just this last week, there was a report that came out that if a shooting war developed over Taiwan, that we had enough battlements to last 8 days. And then we would run out of munitions. We wouldn't be able to continue the battle after 8 days. So you could say, well, what the heck difference does that make? Well, it tells you that we're going to spend more on defense. Period.
Yeah, for sure.
3 of these scenarios say that that defense is going to be a big deal. War, trade, some kind of war, either with majors involved or not involved. War is going to be more the norm and going in the future for the next few years. Well, then you got to start thinking about how does that impact me? Can I be a part of that? So, for example, geographies that have defense infrastructures will probably do well. So if you're running restaurants or dry cleaners, you can think that economy will probably do well because we're in the defense industry, this marketplace, and I'll do better there than I'll do someplace that's going to be a declining part of the government spending.
Very well said, Adam. To go back to one thing you said about that attorney, and a lot of people say to focus on or go and be passionate about something. And if you're passionate about something that no one wants to buy, you're not going to get the level of success that you're looking for or that you want. So I think there's a huge warning there regarding that. And then as far as regarding all these 4 scenarios you mentioned, feel free to email us, Manny@sparkpartners.com, Adam@sparkpartners.com. We'd be happy to send you a link. And if you have any further discussions on that, we'd be happy to go there as well. So any last thoughts for us, Adam?
Yeah, I think that this geopolitical events is a difficult thing to wade in on your own, but we would be happy to run a session for anybody. We can do it in person or we can do it by Zoom and, just explore. I think it's worth doing a couple times a year just to you kind of say, what should I be watching for geopolitically and how the things that could trigger a big change in my business.
Very well said. Thanks again. Cheers.
Cheers.